Now, what we have tried to capture here is that there's certain details that should be a part of your lease contracts to actually identify those as a lease contract, which means that unless, let's say, 3 or 4 points are not a part of my lease contract, we cannot clearly say that's a lease contract. Okay. Now, coming here, those critical identifiers would be one, which is an identified asset. There should be an identified asset in your lease contract. If there's no identified asset, if it is a service contract, it doesn't form part of a lease contract. Okay. When I say identified asset, we are talking about a physically distinct asset. Okay. For example, just the example that we've taken earlier, if I'm reaching out to a supplier or a landlord for renting out a residential plot or a flat, that flat represents a physically distinct property. Okay. And which means that it qualifies the first condition of being an identified asset here. I have a complete detail of the property in my lease contract, and hence I can clearly identify the asset. Or I have access to substantial usage of that particular property. In terms of capacity, for example, you're taking a machine on lease. Okay. The capacity of the machine is to produce 2,000 quantities per week, for example. Now you have rights or you have access to produce around more than 90% of the total capacity, which means that you have the asset with you, and it's not just a service contract of renting out to someone else and asking for their services to create those units or quantities and provide any sort of services that we have. Right? So the first condition will always remain being an identified asset. If there's no asset in the contract, it cannot be termed as a lease contract. Okay. Now, once we have identified the asset, is where we go to the next point, which is right to control. This means that whatever property you are taking on lease, okay, or on rent, for better use of words here, you should have a complete right of control on that property. If there's a property which you're taking on lease, okay, but the right of control is again with the landlord, it cannot be termed as a lease contract. Okay. Now, just taking an example here. Okay. Assume we're talking about Oracle Fusion. Okay. Now, Oracle Fusion here provides SaaS services, which is subscription as a service, right? Now, here I have the right to use, but the right to control the entire asset, right? The right to control Oracle Fusion from backend, the right to modify, right to update, alter, lies with Oracle, which is my landlord, right? In such case, I cannot term SaaS model to be a lease contract here, and hence it is a licensing cost that I incur as an operating expenditure in my P&L, and I never create a leasing contract here, right? So that's on the right to control. So we have discussed you need an identified asset, you need the right to control, and then again the right to control should be for a period of time. Okay. It cannot be a contract where you have just procured the property and you're not paying or not using for a particular period of time. For example, you went to the landlord and you asked the landlord, I want to purchase your property. I want to take your property right now. And the period of time of usage becomes zero because you're going ahead and purchasing the property in the system, right? So there has to be a period of time. And when we talk about a period of time, it includes a rent-free period, which means that there could be scenarios where the landlord might come up and say that there's still certain construction activities going on to the property, and I will provide you a rent-free period of 2 to 3 months while I will complete the construction activities. In that particular case, I have a rent-free period with me, but still that rent-free period will be a part of my entire lease term. Similarly, if we have any non-cancelable period, okay, let's say I have a contract with the landlord and we have agreed that until 3 years we won't be able to cancel the lease contract. So that 3 years becomes a part of my lease term. This also includes any renewal options that you might have as a part of your lease contract. We'll come to those, how this works in system. But again, to understand about options and renewal terms, there's a renewal term in your lease contract, and you are pretty sure that you will be exercising this particular option, which means that you might be extending the lease term. The lease term, which is your non-cancelable period, will also include your renewal period. Okay. And I'll explain how this works in Oracle as well. But for better understanding, the entire period of time or the lease term includes all three of these particular options. Right. Now, these are exemplary. These are for understanding what constitutes my period of time or my lease term, but there could be other scenarios as well, which forms part of my lease term here. Right. Now, I've identified the asset. I have the right to control. I have certain period of time for which I'm going to use the asset and then provide it back to the lessor. And there has to be an exchange of consideration here. Okay. Now, when we talk about consideration, if you're saying that I'm taking a property for free, that doesn't amount to a lease contract. There's no values to be computed. There's no contract to be maintained. It's a non-lease contract to be handled by other regulatory rules. But if all of these four conditions are satisfied, is where I term that this actually is a lease contract. Okay. Now again, this is more from an understanding perspective as a part of implementation. When we go with the client and we work towards implementation, the point of identification of whether this particular contract is a lease contract lies, or the onus of identification lies with the customer. As part of the implementation team, we are not obligated to understand whether this is a lease contract or not. But in terms of understanding how the entire lease model works, it's very important that we also understand these 4 points so that in case there are any questions, there are any clarifications, we can also point out towards client that these might be things you might be doing wrong.